The evacuation of Aleppo is halted, with tens of thousands still trapped, and reports that evacuees were dragged from convoys and killed in cold blood. Good evening. As we speak, frantic international efforts are being made to ensure that this morning's bloody breakdown of the evacuation of Aleppo does not become absolute, leaving tens of thousands at the mercy of Assad's troops and Shia militias seeking revenge. Russia has declared wrongly that the evacuation is over, and those left in a tiny enclave of besieged Aleppo are rebel fighters unwilling to give up. But we know on this programme that tens of thousands of civilians are still left in the city, desperate to be allowed to evacuate, uncertain of what is more risky, the reprisals of leaving or the reprisals of staying behind. And we'll have a special report tonight focusing on the last days of the siege and daily life for Aleppo's children.
Also tonight, hundreds of prisoners go on the rampage at a jail in Birmingham. Specialist riot teams are drafted in. Critics say it's evidence of a prison system at breaking point. Unhappy holidays. Airport staff vote for a two-day strike over Christmas, joining Southern Rail workers and Crown Post Office staff. Is it a new winter of discontent? President Obama threatens retaliation against Russia after the CIA judges that cyber attacks were an attempt to influence the election.
There was hope, and then it was snatched away. The attempt to evacuate thousands of civilians from rebel-held Aleppo has halted after reports of gunfire and killings at a checkpoint. Urgent talks are underway to try and resurrect the deal, which depends on insurgents lifting their own siege around two pro-government towns. Until that happens, some 50,000 people remain trapped in Aleppo, desperate to get out. In a moment, we'll get some unique insight into exactly what it's like for the people who live that daily terror. But first, here's Fatima Manji.
Reunion is bittersweet. The grief of leaving behind their homes, somewhat tempered by the relief of having made it out alive. For some, it was too much to bear. In the early hours, thousands were evacuated from eastern Aleppo, survivors of a nearly 6-year-long civil war.
They killed us and shot at us with airplanes and wounded us. They slaughtered us. We got out from below the rubble.
As they headed to opposition areas, amid tears, a defiant air remained. Shouts of "We will return."
The war is not finished. God willing, I will be back. The blood of martyrs will not go to waste.
By mid-morning, Russia claimed the evacuation of women and children from the city was complete. But then a sudden halt. Rebel sources say pro-government forces opened fire, that Iranian-backed militias stopped a bus and confiscated phones and belongings.
They brought 2 tanks from the convoy. They split men, women and children up and told us to lay down on the floor. We stayed 2 hours not knowing what was going on.
Meanwhile, the Syrian government blamed rebels for shooting at the convoy. Who was actually responsible and why remain unanswered questions. The result, though, is clear. Buses sent back, evacuation suspended. East Aleppo residents are once again trapped. Some sit in streets, huddled up, lighting fires amid ruins to protect themselves from the biting cold. Inside the city of Aleppo, the government has almost complete control. One small rebel enclave remains, estimated by the UN to host 50,000 people who are waiting to leave. Although the escape is currently blocked, if it reopens, it will allow people to flee to Idlib and other opposition-held areas. In Idlib province itself, 2 pro-government villages, Foua and Kafraya, home to 20,000 people, are under siege by rebel groups. Footage from earlier in the week shows the villages under fire from rebel rockets. Syrian government supporters are demanding aid convoys be let in, and civilians there should be allowed to leave at the same time as those in Aleppo. In rebel Aleppo, Channel 4 News filmmaker Waad al-Khatib is still trapped in the city. The makeshift hospital struggles on, using light from a mobile phone to carry out surgery. Doctors operated on one of those wounded from this morning.
The Red Cross and the Red Crescent tried to enter East Aleppo, but they prevented them from doing so.
They thought the end was in sight, that they might finally get out. But East Aleppo is still filled with people who are desperate, exhausted and uncertain of what happens next.
Well, earlier I spoke to Zahir al-Shamali, a citizen journalist who was forced to return to Aleppo today. He told us what happened when one of the convoys which was trying to leave was turned back.
The buses haven't arrived. We waited until 2 p.m., 3 p.m. There was about 25 cars, including in these cars there was about 800 men and women and children.
So these
and
are
patients.
civilian cars evacuating about 800 women and children.
Yes, that's it, of course.
And were these cars allowed to leave?
Yeah, they were allowed to leave and have got the green light by the Red Crescent and the Red Cross. All of a sudden, as many of the eyewitnesses who I've talked with during the last hour, they said that all of a sudden tanks showed up, a Russian tank, and there were soldiers coming from everywhere. Their accents were totally Lebanese.
In other words, the convoy of civilian cars packed with 800 men, women and children left where you were, and then your friends who witnessed this say that they were ambushed by these Shia militiamen and by the Russians.
Yes, after they came in, the militias members, they asked every man to take off from the cars, and but they left the women and children to stay in. They caught them all of them in the ground. Then they handcuffed them. They were kicked really brutally by those militias and hit. They have killed 4 people. One of them was a passenger in an ambulance car, and he was having his wife pregnant, and they have took many hostages. I don't know how many hostages they had at the time. They have took many of them hostages, and we don't really know until now, until the moment, what is their fate, whether they're dead or alive.
Zahir, the Russians have said that all the civilians have now left Aleppo. But clearly that's not true, because you're still there and there are many other people still there.
From this morning, no one have left. We've been waiting for the buses to come in, but they have never showed up, and we were waiting for hours during the night and during the day, and they have never showed up. As we were informed that they were about to show, and they were just preparing them.
All right, Zahir, thank you very much indeed.
Yes, you're welcome.
And good luck to you.
Thanks. Take care and have a good night.
He looked exhausted. So whilst the world has watched appalled as ceasefire and evacuation deals have been made and broken in Aleppo, it's been hard to imagine what it was really like to be trapped and injured in a tiny piece of a broken city, bombed from the air and surrounded by rebels and militias on the ground. Residents have sent out video and recorded final messages, but we haven't really seen the sheer terror of daily life. That's exactly what our camerawoman, Waad Al-Khatib, has been filming. Recent days like this inside the last hospital in rebel-held Aleppo. And a warning, the images from the very start are upsetting. 'Tender words for a child that can't find its own. Aleppo is a grim stage with an ever-diminishing cast of survivors. And these are the last of the last. Fatima is the only adult left of 3 families whose apartment block was obliterated by a Russian or Syrian bomb.
ما بعرف ايش ضرب هلا ابن الحرام هلا ابن الحرام نحن مالكين غافلين ما حسينا وطرينا نزل فينا فوقنا كلها يلا اولادي راحوا كلهم يا يوم اولادي راحوا شو اسمه الصبي اللي فوق خالد
Fatima comes across a neighbor. The teenage boy with the hat is called Mahmoud. He used to live upstairs. The baby boy he's holding is his little brother, Ismail Mohammed, 1 month old. His face is the only restful thing in this bedlam. But this is the sleep of the dead. Ismail was suffocated in the ruins, and Mahmoud doesn't want to let go of his brother's body. Aleppo is a place where the children have stopped crying. In the corridor, Mahmoud is still cradling his baby brother. War has reversed roles, and the boy now acts like the father that he's lost.
يا ربي يعيش انا بلاد يا ربي نزل فوقنا بس ما صابنا غير هيك بدنا نمون هدول ولادك.
A nurse leads in a brother and sister. They go from room to room. We don't know their names, and they don't know yet if they're orphans. They left their father in the rubble, and they're looking for their mother. Fatima now sees proof of the news that she had feared most. Why have you left me? She calls out to the daughter that she describes as her rock, knowing that this question in this place has no real answer. And in another room, brother and sister are still waiting for news of their mother. On another hospital bed, blanketed with dust, exhausted beyond words by a life beyond description. And that footage was filmed by Waad Al-Khatib before this week's ceasefire and partial evacuations. Jackie.
Now, a specialist riot squad has been deployed to a privately run Birmingham jail after a major disturbance spread to 4 wings. Disorder broke out at HMP Birmingham this morning when inmates managed to get hold of an officer's keys. At one point, smoke could be seen rising from the building. Well, our Home Affairs correspondent Darshna Soni is there. Darshna.
Well, earlier today, Jackie, G4S described what's been happening here as a low-level incident. But just look at the extraordinary scenes. We have a row of riot police, dozens of police vans stretching into the distance. This road, which is a major route into Birmingham, completely shut off. There are fire engines, ambulances, dozens of police cars parked outside. G4S has had to admit that it has lost control of what's going on inside this prison, and that is a huge admission of failure. It is the prison service who have now come in and taken over. And we were filming around the back of the prison just earlier on today, and we saw a huge plume of smoke billowing out. We heard prisoners shouting, we heard dogs barking, we saw what appeared to be firecrackers going off. And it's very telling that although prisoners aren't supposed to have access to phones, we've spoken to 2 inmates who have been describing what they witnessed. One even told me, Jackie, that he had access to 3 different smartphones, and they've been posting pictures and video on social media. Now, we understand that the trouble seems to have started when prisoners were frustrated about a lack of access to hot water, to television and to the gym. And we were told that one prisoner threatened a guard with a used syringe, and that while that officer was distracted, another one stole his keys, which is obviously hugely worrying. And we're told now that prisoners have taken over 4 separate wings and that as many as 400 prisoners could be involved. Now, G4S took over the running of this prison in 2011, and critics say that what's been happening here today shows that the private sector is suffering from many of the same issues as the public sector: a shortage of staff, not enough officers, a record number of prisoners. Indeed, as Simon Israel now reports, this is the 3rd major incident inside an English prison in less than 2 months.
More than 400 prisoners have torn apart 4 wings of an overcrowded, understaffed Victorian Cat B G4S-run jail in the heart of Birmingham. Squads of riot-trained prison officers were drafted in. The other 7 wings of the jail, which houses another 1,000 prisoners, were locked down. At least 1/3 of the jail has been wrecked. So the hundreds will have to be shipped out to other prisons in a system already stretched to its limits.
Prisons are absolutely in a crisis point where they're unable to recruit and retain staff. Over 30 staff have left Birmingham in the last couple of weeks. This is indicative of many jails up and down the country, public and private. The system's really in a state.
Mobile phone footage, purported to be from inside the prison, was posted on Twitter. One photo showed some damage on a deserted wing. Another was of a prisoner trying to break into an office. By late afternoon, G4S handed control over to the Ministry of Justice, which invoked emergency procedures and drafted in more prison riot squads. These are the 3rd serious prison disturbances in 7 weeks. The last one was at Bedford, where 200 prisoners went on the rampage and posted footage online using mobiles smuggled into the jail. A threatened day of protest by prison officers over dangerous conditions was ruled unlawful, but it prompted Justice Secretary Liz Truss to declare safety was a priority. But the recruitment of a promised 2,500 officers can't come quick enough. Today's riot is proof of that. It's reported to have begun in P Wing just after 9 a.m. this morning in the Vulnerable Prisoners Unit, and then spread to the wing opposite, N Wing. Keys, said to have been taken from a prison governor, then gave prisoners access to the other 2 wings as well. And all possibly triggered by an argument over prisoner medication.
People look at the medications, they start kicking off weight, they make them wait a couple of hours, whatever, stuff like that, you know what I'm trying to say to you. So that's why they're kicking off in there. That's what I heard. That's what it's about. But anyway, in general, loads of drugs goes in there as well, everything.
Tonight there were loud bangs heard from inside the walls as officers attempted to regain control. Smoke suggests fires have been lit. Prison vans are being lined up to transfer hundreds to other already overcrowded jails. And yes, there'll be yet another inquiry. But as more riot-trained units pour into the prison, G4S may have to face having to shut down an entire jail for the first time in its history.
Well, joining me now to discuss this is the Conservative MP Robert Neal, who chairs the Justice Select Committee, the Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott, and Carl Cattermole, a former prisoner. Welcome to you all. Carl, let me start with you. The details of what happened in Birmingham are really quite astonishing, aren't they? But are you surprised, having spent a year in a whole number of prisons in 2011?
The only thing I'm surprised at is how unsurprised I am. All of the elements have been laid for this incident to unfurl. It's been a long time in the making, and we've seen incident after incident, and it's entirely predictable.
And why is it predictable in your book?
Because of the way that the tensions inside jail, it's just ready to break. Last week we seen people getting angle grinders over the fence and escaping out of Pentonville. The week before we seen record numbers of suicides. I mean, what's
Is it
next?
overcrowding? Is it the lack of prison guards? Is it drugs inside prison?
I think it's all of the above. While I was inside, I saw a surplus of drugs and a lack of education, and it should be exactly the opposite way round.
Robert Neal, let me turn to you. I mean, you can't be surprised by this, can you, when you see the reduction, the dramatic reduction under the Tories of prison staff? 20,000 in 2010, now we're down to just above 14,000, a reduction of 6,000, but the number of prisoners has stayed more or less the same.
Well, that's right, and that's why our committee, on a cross-party basis, warned actually earlier this year that this was a time bomb that was ticking, that there was a crisis in our prisons. That I think, frankly, we did probably reduce guards too many in the past, and actually it's good news that in response to our report, The current Justice Secretary has published actually a very comprehensive reform and safety plan, which we were calling for, and actually is now recruiting extra guards. But that takes time to get them trained up. And, of course, the emergency problem is now. Can I just make one other point?
Very briefly.
Carl's point's really important, too, about the regime that we have in prisons and how we actually do proper rehabilitation there.
But
he's absolutely right on the tensions.
That's another subject for later on, but just briefly, 4 riots in 2 months, and this one could be one of the worst that we've seen in years.
Certainly looking that way, yeah. And this is a problem which has happened both in privately and publicly run systems, so it applies across the piece. I think that does indicate that we have got a situation where if people are locked down 22, 23 hours a day, as we've discovered, that breeds tension. That breeds violence, and as you rightly say, we're not actually keeping the prisons secure enough to stop contraband getting in.
We know that this government has said that they will increase the number of prison staff, but do you have faith that they can actually sort out this problem?
I don't have faith they can sort out the problem. Prisons are a people business. You need the right level of staff, and you need the right quality of staff. I myself don't believe G4S should be running prisons. The fact that they had to hand over to the prison department that they couldn't cope with the situation tells you its own story.
So if you were in government, would you say no more private running of prisons? I mean, get rid of the private companies to do it, or is it just G4S that's the problem?
My view is that private companies should not be involved in taking away people's liberty. And actually, it's clear that G4S don't have the quality of staff to manage a crisis like this.
But, I mean, the thing is that it's not just the lack of staff and the overcrowding, it's also that these prisons were built in the 1840s. These are Victorian prisons.
It's a Victorian
When your government, when the last Labour government was in power, they weren't rebuilding prisons either, were they?
They weren't. Probably we should have. These are Victorian prisons, which are now hugely overcrowded, even given what the numbers were in Victorian times. And I think they're a time bomb.
Carl, I don't know if you came across both G4S or other private prison guards and then government ones. Is there a difference there? Did you feel that you were treated in different ways, depending on who was running the prison?
I was in a Victorian prison. I was also in a new build prison. And I think that these arguments posed by people who've never served time are kind of actually relatively null. The thing is that it's actually how you treat the prisoners on an interpersonal level, not the environments that you put them in. And I think that closing down inner-city Victorian jails and moving people far, far away from their friends and their family is
a bad idea.
Detrimental for us, it's detrimental for law-abiding people. People should be kept close to their family. Holloway prison has been shut. It was the only female prison in London. People are now having to traverse across the country to maintain these links to their friends and family. It's really damaging.
From what you've heard today and from what you experienced yourself, do you think that this government has lost control of the prison system?
I mean, it's evident that they have. But the thing is, we could call for a resignation. We've seen failure after failure, but who are they going to put in place? I mean, we need a politician who's actually going to take brave steps and do what, the law-abiding world
Robert,
needs to be done.
the Prime Minister is the former Home Secretary. She was Home Secretary for 6 years. This is part of her jurisdiction. Now she's running the country. Has she lost control?
No,
both in her previous job and this one?
No, I don't think she has. I don't think actually any one party can say that it's absolved of all blame in this. We have not invested in prisons for almost generations.
And why is that?
Well, I was a young barrister, about 20, 30 years ago, and it was bad then. What we haven't done is actually tackle the brave bit that Carl refers to, is actually saying that we lock too many people up. We should be finding better alternatives to custody, and we should have better regimes for people, much more education, much more rehabilitation. But you can't do that in those old prisons, mate.
But you've been in charge for 6 years now. This problem keeps getting worse, and you keep getting warned, not just by the events, but also by prison officers. And they're the ones at the sharp end. They keep telling you this is just not good enough. The system doesn't work.
The prison population, I think, has been a real problem to us, but there are also other elements that we've got to deal with, which are new on the block. For example, the growth of legal highs, new psychoactive substances, which come into prison all too readily, which the government is moving to criminalise, but are still in there at the moment. That's a real problem. It makes people much, much more volatile than staff have ever experienced before. They're really tough for staff.
Diana, but if you were in charge today, what would you actually be doing to make the situation better?
We need to invest in prisons. We need to have more prison officers. We need to have a better regime. If you bang people
back to the numbers that we had 5 years ago, or even more than that?
Well, I mean, even Kenneth Clark was saying we had to cut prison numbers. If you bang people up for 22 hours a day, they will explode, and that's what we've seen.
Can I just ask you one final question, Carl? And tell me whether this is true. Apparently, more and more prisoners in more and more prisons, including Wandsworth, the biggest in Europe, are being kept in their cells for the weekend because they're simply so you're locked in your cell on a Friday night, you're let out on a Monday morning. Is that true?
Yeah.
Appalling.
It's insane. You know, it's kind of a weird metaphor, but if a dog misbehaves and you lock it in a room and deprive it of food and treat it like rubbish, then it's going to come out and it's going to bite you. But if you treat it well, it might come out and be your best friend. You know, like prisoners can contribute to society, and it's a minimal investment for maximum payback.
We're going to see more of these incidents, I think, in the
100%
coming
we're
months.
going to see more.
Well, I think we've got a good plan for reform, but it's got to be put in place more urgently than we've been able to do so.
We've run out of time. Carl Catamont, Dan Abbott, thank you very much indeed. Jackie.
And more on tonight's main news now. We've just received these pictures from besieged Aleppo showing chaotic scenes at one of the crossing points for people to leave the rebel-held area earlier today. Gunfire broke out as hundreds tried to leave through corridors into government-held territory. It's believed pro-Assad militia targeted convoys as they approached the crossing. Now, if you're hoping to join the great Christmas getaway next weekend, then beware. Check-in staff, baggage handlers and cargo crew at 18 airports across the country have voted for a 48-hour strike from December the 23rd. Pilots at Virgin Atlantic and British Airways cabin staff are also planning industrial action over the festive period. Our political correspondent Michael Crick is in Westminster now. Michael.
Yes, it looks like there's going to be quite a flurry of industrial action over the next few days. It was announced late this afternoon that more than 1,500 members of the Union Unite who work for Swissport, dealing with baggage and cargo and check-in desks at 18 different airports all around the country, are planning to go on strike next Friday and next Saturday, Christmas Eve, if Swissport don't agree to talks at the conciliation service ACAS. Now, this is over pay. They say, Unite, that they haven't had a pay rise since 2014 and that they've been in talks with the company for almost 2 years now. They say that the pay offer they've had from Swissport barely matches inflation and that it doesn't, the pay offer doesn't apply to overtime, which has made them angry and has, and that's why they voted by almost 2-1 for this strike action. Now, it's unlikely to affect the two big London airports, Heathrow and Gatwick, and it won't affect London City Airport. It'll be involve the big regional airports all around the country: Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Belfast, East Midlands, Manchester, Bristol, Cardiff, and so on. And that, of course, is at the same time as other disputes within the aviation industry involving Virgin pilots and BA cabin staff on the railways. Of course, this week we've had 3 days of strikes by drivers at Southern Rail, next week by conductors at Southern Rail, and also a strike by Crown Post Office staff in the next few days. One good piece of news tonight, though, drivers who make deliveries for Argos have called off their strike because they've accepted a better pay offer.
Michael, thanks very much.
President Obama has warned that he'll retaliate against Russia for its alleged interference in the US presidential election campaign. The CIA has declared that cyber attacks, which targeted the Democratic Party, were intended to help propel Donald Trump to the White House. Mr. Trump himself has dismissed, even mocked these claims, whilst Russia says that America needs to provide evidence or risk looking indecent. Well, Porrick O'Brien is in Washington. Porrick, tell us more.
Well, Matt, President Obama just about to take to the stage to give his last press conference of this year. And the big question, the burning question, will be when he talks about retaliating against Russia for hacking, exactly what does he mean? And of course, if anything newsworthy comes out of that during the programme, we'll bring it straight to you. But the hacking story gathering more and more momentum here. The reason, at its heart, claims that Russia hacked American democracy and did more than hack it, planted a virus in it. The Trump thank you rally last night in Hershey, Pennsylvania, dubbed the sweetest place on earth. USA drain the swamp, build that wall. There were no chance of, what do we want? To go after the Russians who hacked American democracy by only releasing Democrat emails timed to bolster the Trump presidential campaign, according to the CIA. I guess it lacks a certain ring.
Mr. Putin is well aware of my feelings about this because I spoke to him directly about it.
It is President Obama's clarion call today, though.
When any foreign government tries to impact the integrity of our elections, we need to take action, and we will, at a time and place of our own choosing. Some of it may be explicit and publicized, some of it may not be.
So just to be clear, President Obama considers this so serious it warrants the declaration of a sort of cyber Cold War. It won't last as long as the last one. Probably has a shelf life of about 35 days. Then Donald Trump takes over. So why are we here? A quick recap. Earlier this year, the chief of staff of Hillary Clinton's emails were hacked, and over October and November released in batches by WikiLeaks, timed for maximum impact. The damage they did, they spoke to a cozy relationship between Hillary Clinton and Wall Street bankers. So why has the whole thing now reignited? Because off the back of newspaper reports, the CIA have acknowledged that they were purposely leaked to maximize impact and damage Clinton's campaign, bolstering Trump's campaign. How has the president-elect reacted? By trashing the CIA, by speaking of a politicized decision to release this information, by basically positioning himself as arbiter-in-chief of the intelligence they offer. The bigger picture here, the relationship reset between the US and Russia. For satirists, the new year will catapult us from Cold War to love, actually. Now it's about clinching deals, not sweet nothings. This one-time Trump advisor, just returned from addressing business leaders in Moscow, spoke to us today.
And there have been a lot of tensions because of Crimea, Ukraine, and also Syria. But I think that it's important for a new administration to start things fresh.
So your take is that Donald Trump is perfectly entitled to reset that relationship?
Absolutely.
The other relationship that really matters now, the one between President Trump and new CIA boss Mike Pompeo.
Just want to ask, do you agree with the determination by the CIA that Russia interfered in the election? Is there a reason for a pause? Could we talk?
It's back on the ground at a Trump rally. You really see why this matters. Patriots whose relationship with key American institutions in meltdown.
So you don't trust your intelligence services?
No, essentially, why? You'd have to be an idiot to trust what the CIA says, yeah.
Cue the man that these people trust more than any other public figure.
I will never, ever let you down, believe me.
And if he doesn't deliver, you better watch out. Now, also on that hacking operation, audio has emerged. Very strong words from Hillary Clinton at a function last night. She spoke about Vladimir Putin personally directing this hacking operation. Now, while all eyes are on the relationship between the US and Russia, the one to watch is the relationship between the US and China. You'll remember the week before last, Donald Trump sort of tugging at the rug of underneath the one China policy with a call to the Taiwanese president. Well, it's emerged today that that has ratcheted up a notch. The Chinese seizing an unmanned American drone in the South China Sea. So in the run-up to Christmas here, the geopolitical plates are on the move.
Indeed they are. Porrick, thanks very much. Jackie.
There are rapes, there are killings, there are human rights abuses on a daily basis. But, says the UN, the persecution of Burma's minority Rohingya people is being ignored. And it's accused Aung San Suu Kyi's government of a counterproductive, even callous approach. The scale of the crisis is sharply revealed by satellite imagery released by Human Rights Watch that appears to show the burning of Rohingya villages in Rakhine State. We should warn you, there are distressing images in this report by our Asia correspondent Jonathan Miller.
The scorched earth tactics of a counterinsurgency operation on Burma's border with Bangladesh has left a swathe of villages, charred ruins. 30,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled amid reports of gang rape, torture and murder and allegations of collective punishment. These videos, which have proved impossible to independently verify, purportedly show hundreds of Rohingya fleeing in terror. The Burmese military have forcefully denied that this is even happening. Rohingyas are not recognized in Burma, also called Myanmar. There are more than 1 million of them. Most are denied citizenship and persecuted by the Buddhist majority. Unwanted in Burma, they're unwelcome too here in Bangladesh, into which, as refugees, they've now escaped. This woman's child drowned crossing the Naf River. This man lost his 3 children when their boat sank. Mosena says they slit the throats of villagers in front of us. They took the pretty girls and raped them. A journalist working for Channel 4 News conducted interviews in Bangladesh last week. We've had to protect identities. All were in tears.
They came at 8 a.m. and hacked my husband to death. I witnessed this. They hacked him with a long knife. Now I have nothing.
They looted and burned our homes. They threw our 4-year-old on the fire. They shot at children. Some were killed. We couldn't bury the bodies.
I watched as soldiers cut my uncle's throat. They stole our possessions and our rice. They burned our homes and shot at us. If they could catch you, they slit your throat. My baby boy died because my wife was taken to be raped.
This video was released by a Rohingya rebel group called the Al Yaqin Mujahideen, whom the Burmese say is backed by foreign jihadists. 2 attacks by them on security forces inside Burma's Rakhine state precipitated the military sweep. We are not terrorists, he says. We are fighting for our rights. He claims these wounded are civilians. Human Rights Watch has now released analysis of satellite data reinforcing allegations of what one UN official has branded ethnic cleansing. The satellite analysis reveals a pattern of systematic burning over time, indicating the westward advance of Burmese forces from a main road. The first 3 villages right next to that road were burned over a 5-day period before mid-October. These before and after high-definition images show extensive destruction and burn scars in 2 of them. Thermal imaging data from another satellite sensor also detected multiple active fires in those 2 villages. One village, Wapek, was razed to the ground over a 1-month period. There is a large government military base right next to the village. The Burmese military has refuted this evidence, releasing aerial shots they say contradict the claims. They say Rohingya militants burned down their own villages. It's not the first bout of anti-Rohingya violence. 4 years ago, Burmese Buddhist lynch mobs working with the military forced the displacement of more than 100,000 people. In recent days, there have been demonstrations in Southeast Asia's majority Muslim countries against what's happening in Myanmar, asking what Aung San Suu Kyi, Nobel laureate and the country's de facto leader, is actually doing. Malaysia's Prime Minister even publicly rebuking her.
The world cannot sit by and watch genocide taking place.
As the international clamour grows, Aung San Suu Kyi has now made an unprecedented call for a regional meeting to discuss the crisis. Meanwhile, very little aid has been allowed in and journalists are barred. Malnutrition among children is at emergency levels and the Burmese military is accused of covering up a war crime.
Jonathan Miller reporting. Police have dropped an investigation into Labour MP Keith Vaz after allegations about his private life were made in a Sunday Mirror story. The MP stepped down as Home Affairs Select Committee chairman in September after the paper claimed he had paid for the services of 2 male escorts. Police say no one has been charged.
The National Child Sexual Abuse Inquiry will retain all 13 of its investigations after an internal review declared it shouldn't be scaled back. Chairwoman Professor Alexis Jay denied the inquiry was too broad to succeed, even though the revelations about abuse in sport could become yet another strand. Britain's largest ever public inquiry has been beset by problems, including a flurry of departures of top figures. In September, Ben Emerson QC resigned as counsel to the inquiry. Well, earlier today, our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel spoke with Professor Jay, the inquiry's chair.
So everyone now is on board, all sailing in the right direction, are they?
I would certainly say there's been a significant improvement in morale.
And who's going to replace Ben Emerson?
We're nearing completion of the recruitment process. I can't tell you that today, but we hope to be able to make an announcement soon.
Forgive me, but while this inquiry, in inverted commas, grinds on, even you yourself say children are being abused and exploited in this country.
Of course.
At this very moment. And so you can understand the public perception is going, you're spending all this money, 25, 30 million pounds so far.
23.6 actually.
And you've come up with nothing so far.
I don't believe we've come up with nothing at all. You may not, that may be the problem, that it is in part our responsibility that we've not made it public what we've been doing, but we cannot proceed without analysing documentation and evidence, and you will have seen from my report that we have in total hundreds of thousands of documents to review and look at. It's essential, if we are to fulfil our terms of reference within the legal framework of the Inquiries Act, that we analyse this material.
Can you understand the sense that there doesn't appear to be a sense of urgency about this inquiry?
I do not accept at all any suggestion that I haven't injected any degree of urgency into this, because that's the whole point of the review, is to set a timescale and stick to it.
And will you stick to it? Can you guarantee that?
It depends what else arises. Of course, it's my intention to do so, and the intention of the staff. And indeed, I've set up different internal oversight arrangements to constantly be monitoring what's being done and whether we're sticking to the timescales. I do not like missing deadlines.
Professor Alexis Jay speaking to Simon Israel earlier today.
The national lottery operator Camelot has been fined £3 million by the gambling watchdog after paying out a £2.5 million claim involving a deliberately damaged ticket. The penalty was handed down by the Gambling Commission over a 2009 incident that went undiscovered until last year. The Commission said it was not 100% certain a fraud had been committed, but it was satisfied it was highly likely. Camelot has apologised. Almost 11,000 badgers have been killed since September in an effort to control the spread of bovine tuberculosis, and the government says the culling is set to continue. Animal welfare campaigners and scientists have criticised the plans, claiming it's inhumane and ineffective, with no evidence that it does lead to a reduction of TB in cows.
2 former soldiers are to be prosecuted for murder in relation to the fatal shooting of an official IRA man in Belfast in 1972. The defendants, known as Soldier A and Soldier C, are the surviving members of the Army patrol which shot Joe McCann. He was 25 when he was shot near his home in the Markets area of Belfast. The soldiers are expected to appear in court in the next few months.
A Royal Marine who's serving a life sentence for killing an injured Taliban fighter in Afghanistan will have to wait until next week before finding out if he will be granted bail, after the judge said he was delaying his decision. Sergeant Alexander Blackman has already spent 3 years in custody, but has since won the right to get his conviction reviewed. Simeon Brown was in court.
There can't be many who arrive at the Court of Appeal to applause from a crowd of veterans. Claire Blackman, seen here, is attending court in support of her husband, who you may know as Marine A. His full name is Alexander Blackman. In 2013, the Army sergeant was convicted of murder for this. That was the fatal moment.
Yeah, shock rocket's mortal call, you. Nothing you would do to us.
I know.
Exactly.
Obviously, this doesn't go anywhere, fellas.
Yeah, roger, mate.
I've just broken the convention.
Yeah, roger.
Those words recorded on the headcam of a fellow Marine belonged to Sergeant Blackman. The convention he broke obliges soldiers to protect prisoners of war. The court-martial gave him a life sentence for murdering a captured Taliban fighter. But his supporters here are hoping for him to be freed on bail after he was granted a right to appeal his conviction. His case has become a major campaign amongst a section of the servicemen community.
There's not one man here wearing this hat that would not have done what he did.
We've had people fly down from Scotland, we've got people on Facebook supporting us across the globe. So you've got that extent of support, you've just got to see sense.
But the judge did not give the servicemen the news they'd hoped for.
That man is a good man, and that judge is a disgrace.
The court said it was in the interest of justice to adjourn the case because of how heavily it rests on evidence regarding the mental state of Sergeant Blackman, and effectively the prosecution needed more time.
So these former soldiers will be back next Wednesday when the case is scheduled to be heard. That leaves enough time for Sergeant Blackman, potentially, to make it home for Christmas.
Now, after the break, it was one of the major issues dominating the Brexit campaign: freedom of movement and migration. Never easy to get under control, but will it be any easier after Britain pulls out of the European Union?
Welcome back. Theresa May told EU leaders last night she wants to reach a deal on the status of EU citizens living here in the UK early in the Brexit negotiations. One of the main issues up for discussion in any future deal will be freedom of movement. David Cameron failed in his pledge to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. Indeed, net migration from the EU was higher than ever in the year ending in June. But will politicians find it any easier to reduce net migration after Brexit happens? Theresa May left the questions about Brexit hanging in the air as she left the EU summit last night. Earlier, she'd updated other EU leaders on the Brexit process before leaving them to discuss the issue over dinner without her. According to one Prime Minister in the audience, what happens to EU citizens in the UK and vice versa was high on her list of priorities.
The second issue that she raised was that she would like to have the question of UK citizens living in Europe and European citizens living in the UK dealt with in the early part of discussions that will take place.
If EU migrants already in the country are allowed to stay, then what future for freedom of movement? Immigration figures released earlier this month show that in the year to June, net migration from the EU was 189,000. Reducing that number was a key part of the campaign to leave the EU. When it came to the vote, many areas with high levels of low-skilled EU workers voted to leave. Perhaps it's not a surprise then that Theresa May signalled the government is still committed to reducing net migration to the tens of thousands.
Someone who finds themselves out of work or on lower wages because of low-skilled immigration, life simply doesn't seem fair. Change has got to come.
The forthcoming Brexit negotiation gives the government the opportunity to radically restrict migration, but it could come at an economic cost. The question is, in the process of leaving the EU, will the government take the risk? Well, I'm joined now by David Goodhart, Head of Demography, Immigration and Integration at the think tank Policy Exchange, and Faiza Shaheen, Director of the Centre for Labour and Social Studies. David Goodhart, will Brexit cut immigration? That great holy grail?
Yes, I think it undoubtedly will. I mean, it will kind of have to. I mean, the politicians are on the hook to do that. Obviously, there's a difficult balancing act that particularly British governments face, is how do you, on the one hand, respond to the perfectly legitimate desire of a very large majority of the population to reduce the historically unprecedented levels of immigration we've had in the last 20 years without doing too much economic damage. And there will clearly be a balancing act.
And I mean, a lot of business leaders have already spoken about their nervousness that this will cause damage if you significantly cut immigration.
But, you know, business leaders, I mean, to be fair, business leaders are part of the problem here. I mean, you've had a significant cut in training in the last 10 or 15 years. Businesses have been able to just, you know, take people from Europe already trained. A lot of people in Britain feel that the national social contract, as it were, between a British citizen and British employers has been partly broken. You have whole sectors, I mean, like the food and drink business, which is the biggest manufacturing sector, employs about 400,000 people. 120,000 people come from Eastern Europe, and that's all happened in the last 10 years. Now, we don't want to... If you stop that overnight, there's obviously going to be big economic damage. You phase it down gradually.
Faisal Shaheen, can I ask you about the principle? Surely the vote of the referendum proves, as David says, that this is a legitimate aim to cut immigration, that it's a concern of many people, and we've now got to do that.
I mean, what it's shown and what a lot has shown this year is that the fruition of a false narrative, this idea that it's all to blame on immigration somehow. My father-in-law voted for Brexit, for instance, and he works in a factory and he's seen the demographics of that factory change. He's seen his sons not be able to move out, and he worries, he has bought into some of that narrative that blames it all on immigration. When you look at the facts, you know, why aren't we talking more about inequality? The fact that the profit share has risen, wage share has fallen. So this is about, you know, the fat cats. This is about public spending cuts. And instead, it's very neatly boiled down to immigration, which not only is not true, it has real consequences for society and the way in which we get on.
I mean, do you accept that?
I mean, I don't think anyone is claiming it's only immigration, but I mean, to say that immigration is not one of the factors that has discomforted people, and indeed in some parts of the country disadvantaged them. I mean, you know, economists will say that actually the impact of large-scale immigration has not been that great, but there is clearly downward pressure on wages in some sectors, and also just a feeling of sort of being displaced. You know, when whole sectors, you know, bring in people from abroad. This is kind of in-your-face globalisation.
Yes, and in your work, you've recognised that immigration is often a metaphor for different issues.
Exactly, you know,
but isn't that the same as saying it's an excuse? It's part of this false narrative.
No, I mean, I think that's to misunderstand it to say it's a false narrative. I mean, clearly there are. I mean, there's a debate amongst academics and others about, you know, whether populism has arisen because of cultural factors or because of economic factors. I mean, I think it's clearly a mixture of the two, but I think most of the evidence suggests, not just in Britain, but throughout Europe, it's to do with rapidly changing demographies and societies. That is the main reason why people have felt discomforted and have been tempted to vote for populists.
Look, if we look at what's happening in the bottom end of the labour market, where there is some impact of immigration, it's essentially people being played off each other by temping agencies, by businesses wanting to undercut wages and rights. So what we do there is do something about rights and pay. We don't just blame immigrants. And so this is what I'm talking about in terms of not that immigration isn't somewhere on that list, but it is not number one, and that's not what you hear. Week after week after week, we are told by our politicians, leaders, the newspapers, that immigration, Muslims are to blame for most of the problems in this country. That's what we're being told.
David Goodhart mentioned populism there, and isn't part of the argument, some people would say, that your insistence that immigration isn't as big a problem as many people on the ground feel, part and parcel of this sort of populist rage against an elite who just aren't hearing them?
Yeah, and actually, of course, part of that decision-making by that elite, it actually plays to politicians to blame it on immigration as well. They've made policy decisions that have been wrong again and again and again, whether it be on not investing enough in schools or NHS. It plays to them for people to blame people that are their neighbours and in their workplace that they say, well, it's the immigrants. So, you know, this is a very dangerous time. Don't forget how much we've seen xenophobic and racist attacks rise in this country. You know, a response to people saying this is all immigration, which, by the way, is a response to being told it's all immigration, isn't then to play into that more. It's to think about what we do to ensure we have a country that works for everyone.
David Goodhart?
But I think if you ignore the reasonable sentiments that people have about this issue, then as you say, I mean, you create even more hostility and anger. And I think it's, you know, if you look at the surveys, I mean, you know, race equality is part of British common sense. I think most people who voted for Brexit on immigration grounds, and lots of people voted for other reasons too, are are hostile to large-scale immigration. They are not hostile to individual immigrants. And I think, you know, and if
yeah,
you
but
look
there's a big thing here about perceptions, right? I mean, literally, people think that there's 15% of the population is Muslim, and it's 5%.
If it was all about economics and inequality, we would have much more left-wing populism. We have very little left-wing
David
populism.
Goodhart and Faisal, I'm sorry, because the end of the programme, we're going to have to end it there so abruptly. Sorry, but Matt.
Thanks, Jackie. Quick recap of tonight's main news. The attempt to evacuate thousands of civilians from rebel-held Aleppo has stalled while we've been on air. President Obama, in his last press conference of the year, has declared that the Assad regime cannot slaughter its way to legitimacy.
We have seen a deliberate strategy of surrounding, besieging, and starving innocent civilians. We've seen relentless targeting of humanitarian workers and medical personnel, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble and dust. There are continuing reports of civilians being executed, and these are all horrific violations of international law. Responsibility for this brutality lies in one place alone, with the Assad regime and its allies, Russia and Iran, and this blood and these atrocities are on their hands.
President Obama there. Well, we're back tomorrow night at 7:30. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks for watching.